I'm Cierra Bettens. Welcome to APTN News InFocus. What a year it's been. We went from one Liberal Prime Minister to another. The federal government pushed a major piece of legislation through Parliament with zero consultation with Indigenous peoples. Then the government said consultation is really important. There's a major projects office that hopes to fast-track natural resource developments, and a move to end some but not all discrimination in the Indian Act. So to get a review of the year that was and a look ahead, I'm joined by Karyn Pugliese, APTN's online correspondent in Ottawa, and the host of our political show, Nation to Nation. And I'm also joined by Dennis Ward, the host of APTN National News and our one-on-one interview show, Face to Face. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Pumped to be here.
So, Karyn, the first topic I want to cover is the amendments to the Indian Act that eliminated the second generation cutoff. This is something that you've covered extensively, and there's a lot of controversy leading up to it. What can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so you mean the racism itself amendments, as I affectionately call them. That was a line used by the minister to the Senate. So basically what happened is this was the first piece of legislation that Minister Mandy Gulmasti was putting forward. And I think it was actually really important, to establish her, because it's not every day the press secretary calls you up and kind of suggests that you cover something. And this was a story that was suggested to me. Oh, this is coming up. Like, maybe you want to cover this. Most of the time, it's like stuff when you get something like that that's not really news. But this was a piece of legislation that the government is obligated to get through the House by April to deal with a lawsuit. And the lawsuit is for some people who had lost their status under old rules of the Indian Act that no longer exist. Basically, people who self-enfranchised, often under duress, or were enfranchised against their will for a couple of different reasons. And so what happens is it goes to the Senate, and the Senate hears all this testimony, and the Senate Standing Committee on Indigenous Peoples is actually pretty First Nations heavy, like it's Indigenous heavy right now. But the majority of Indigenous people who are on there are First Nations. And some of them are past politicians, and some of them are lawyers. And some of them are both on the same day. And they heard all this testimony, and people were saying, end the second generation cutoff. And the way they want to do it is they're not throwing open the gates. Because I asked about this. Does this mean like anybody with a grandmother can become First Nations now? No. What it means is that under the 1985 rules, some people were, like when the government amended the law the first time, there were people who were made C1s who could pass down their status no matter who they married, and then their children became C2s, and if they married somebody who was non-status First Nations, they could not pass it down. All it does is it makes the C2 C1s. You can pass on in perpetuity your legal status to kids no matter who you marry. So that's the amendment. Mandy Gulmasti doesn't like it. She was very clear at the SCA that she was not going to go ahead with it. And she said that it was her duty to consult on it, which drew a few gasps in the room, as you can imagine, because chiefs have been talking a lot about consultation that they don't think they're getting on very important things. And in this case, the government is saying they must consult on something that the chiefs want. And the chiefs certainly did pass a resolution at the FN in support of these amendments. So we'll see what happens. It could all get reversed and undone in the House of Commons, and that's probably what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. So I want to turn to you, Dennis. It's crazy to think that this happened this year, but less than a week into 2025, Justin Trudeau announced that he would resign from his post as Liberal leader and Canada's Prime Minister. What do you remember about, how this unfolded and the aftermath of it?
Well, very little, to be honest. Actually, I'm just, we're doing a year in review panel coming up, a half-hour panel, and I had to go back and look through the 50 panels that we did do this year because, way back in January 6th, the Prime Minister resigned. Trudeau, that was a pretty big deal, and it's hard to even remember that there was a full election many moons ago. Yeah, it's been a pretty wild year politically for sure, and continues as we went through an election, ended up with a minority government, which I typically like, and then we have some people crossing the floor, and Polyev losing his seat, and now he's going to be up for a leadership review in the new year, and the political intrigue is going to continue for the months ahead.
Karyn, Jordan's Principle is an issue that has come up consistently for you and other reporters across Canada. And I'm wondering, are there any stories from this year that you think really capture the state that it's in?
Yeah, I think two things. One, there was just recently one of the cases that's going through the courts right now where someone has been cut off from Jordan's Principle, or I guess never approved for Jordan's Principle, is the case of Joanne Powless, who's an Oneida grandmother living at Six Nations. She's got mold in her house. She's got 2 kids. She's applied multiple times, twice, and then gone through the courts, winning each step of the way, saying that Jordan's Principle should pay for mold remediation because it's making her kids sick. And the governments are saying it's kind of beyond their scope. And they have several reasons why they won't pay for it. But she just, on December 11th, won at the Federal Court of Appeals. So that could go to the Supreme Court. And that will affect the way that Indigenous Services Canada is cutting them off. If she wins, it will force them to reconsider a lot of cases of children that have been cut off. But if I was to speak to the biggest thing, it goes back to February. I mean, Jordan's Principle, and I've got some data work that I'm going to be releasing shortly onto the website, some charts and graphs and whatnot that kind of tell the story in numbers. But there definitely was a major growth in and take up in the use of Jordan's Principle, particularly in Manitoba. The numbers I've looked at have shown in Manitoba it was the highest per capita use. And of course, there were things that the government came out with that were getting approved. And Dennis will remember this too, because he wrote about it as well, like modeling headshots that probably don't belong under Jordan's Principle or seem to be beyond scope. I mean, we don't really know what the motivations are behind them. One of them was game consoles, and you kind of think, why would you be buying a video game console? But if that video game console is being used by somebody who's dyslexic, because that's how they are able to interact with their computer, or they've got a disability where they can't type, I mean, then it makes sense why it's an extension of a health or educational service, right? But all we were told off the top, and I think ISK made kind of a big deal about this, was that these things were getting approved and it looked nonsensical. So we all went running to the chiefs and saying, what the hell, guys? And, and then you kind of come back around and it's kind of pointed out by Cindy Blackstock and the chiefs, well, what were they doing approving this stuff? Because it's not actually the chiefs who approve things, right? So it was kind of like this political football going back and forth where the department tried very hard to say, look at those bad chiefs taking advantage of this program. And it's kind of like the rubber and glue thing. It bounced off them and kind of ended up sticking back on ISK. But I think the way that kind of story unfolded and the way that we went kind of back and forth on it in a way that I would say was, I mean, you follow the story where it goes as a journalist. But I thought it was kind of bad form on ISK to not stand up and just take the responsibility in the first place. And then, of course, what they did in February is they came up with a bulletin that really restricted and over-restricted access. And it's not me saying that. I got 1,000 pages of an access to information that the Caring Society put on my desk, and I went through it page by page. And it really painted a picture of confusion, bureaucrats cutting some people off and not cutting other people off because there was no real rule. They didn't seem to get the bulletin any faster than anybody else. It looked like a hot mess in there. So I think those are the things that I kind of take away. This program, after all these court cases, after all these years, cannot function properly still.
Dennis, I also want to hear your thoughts on Jordan's Principle and a somewhat relatedly child welfare. What do you think are some key developments that stand out to you from this year in those areas?
Yeah, the fallout from that February bulletin was huge. Layoffs everywhere. School divisions were putting out notices that they were laying off dozens of staff and couldn't do these programs anymore. And I think that there were some people pointing out, that maybe these schools shouldn't have been getting all this funding for students as well. Was it all going to the students, the First Nation students with disabilities or whatever that needed it? But there were massive layoffs, even at like AMC. They closed their Jordan's Principal office for a while. It was pretty bad, and we were hearing so many horror stories from families who were like, this is obviously a case of Jordan's Principle and just not getting the help. And then there was an election and a change in minister and trying to get that minister up to date on what's going on. And yeah, it's been messy, and I don't think that that's resolved itself yet. And maybe we'll get some more info here next week when all this goes back before the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. Same as child welfare, long-term reform. It's been 1 year now, over a year now since Chiefs in Assembly voted down the $47.8 billion package. I believe that was the dollar figure. And negotiations that were supposed to go on by this committee that was set up, the National Children's Chiefs Commission. The government never met with them once. From what we understand, the government never gave them any funding to do any of the consultation that they were supposed to do over the past year. And now the federal government needs to present its plan for long-term reform on December 22nd. And it provided an update just a couple of weeks ago, or maybe a week ago, to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. And its update was, we don't have any update. So this is a big decision, I think, that's coming up here, and will dictate what happens not only with Jordan's Principle, but the future of child welfare reform and potentially the deal that was signed with the Ontario Chiefs that is supposed to be approved and rolling out by next February.
Can I jump in and just say two things on Jordan's Principle? One is that there were a bunch of chiefs in Manitoba that said that they were spending out of pocket because they were told to spend. And now there was a backlog of approvals. This was a year ago that they held a press conference on this. And they didn't know if they were going to get their money back or what was going to happen. And I have no idea if they got their money back. I have no idea if they're out millions of dollars. Some of them said that they had built Jordan's Principle buildings and everything else and were out $1 million. And when I started to reach out to them again to follow up, they were pretty quiet. So I don't know if they were working out deals to get paid back or what was going on there, but I never heard anything about it again. And I haven't gotten them to give me an answer on what happened with the money that they were out. And then Chief David Munias, who is from Cross Lake, along with some other chiefs, were talking about launching a lawsuit. And I've got to get back in touch with him and see what happened to that lawsuit. And that was over that issue of being out of pocket for things that were approved according to the chiefs involved, approved verbally, or they understood were approved, but they were now out of pocket for.
Yeah, it's a good question. Like they were saying, the federal government or whoever was being the Grinch this time last year, that they needed that money returned or Christmas was going to be rough for people. And we haven't heard anything on that. So you kind of wonder if they did get reimbursed.
Yeah, I feel like if they worked out a deal quietly, that might be the reason that they're not saying anything. Or if they feel like they could work out a deal quietly. Sometimes people during periods of negotiations kind of go quiet. So it definitely worth trying to find out what happened.
Yeah, there'll definitely be something to look out for in the new year. So I want to turn back to the new Liberal government, which also saw bringing in the first Indigenous Minister of Indigenous Services Canada, Mandy Golmasti, who we mentioned earlier. But I'm wondering if you could both kind of speak to what her track record has been like so far.
I think, honestly, the biggest thing that she's wearing right now is that S2 legislation, second generation cutoff. It is legislation that comes from her, it was supposed to be like something easy, like an easy win. Whenever, and if you're ever reading like management books or something and the Carney government gets compared so often to a business, what they will tell you as a new manager, go for the easy win, which means do the thing, like put the coffee machine in the office that gives free coffee, something that just makes employees really, really happy, but isn't a heavy lift, that just kind of sets you up as being the good guy. And I think that's what S2 was supposed to be. And instead, Senator Paul Prosper, who made all these amendments, is now like the hero of the day. And Mandeagle Masti is somebody who's going to have to speak against or speak for keeping discrimination in the Indian Act longer, so she can consult people on whether or not they want to eliminate the discrimination and how. It seems like a bit of a smokescreen to me. And that it just, can I just say, like, it compares so poorly to the thing that she didn't do, which she promised that she was going to get that water legislation that died on the order paper last year, introduced this fall. It was not. We're now hearing in the spring. But the thing is, with S2, she was saying, I have to get through this fast. This has to get done because it's an answer to a court case and we have a deadline of April. When meantime, on the water legislation, that was also part of a settlement agreement that they were supposed to pass this legislation. And that was in 2022 was the deadline. And so it's, it died on the order paper fine. But now it's not reintroduced, and the lawyers behind that settlement agreement are refiring it to put pressure, and I expect that April will be the new deadline for them to get something done. But it's also something to watch, because people are very suspicious that the broad recognition of governance that it gives First Nations over water is something that Alberta and Ontario are identifying as something that's in the way of project development. So that was in the legislation under the Trudeau government. It's been delayed. The suspicion is, although we haven't had any confirmation of this from the government, but that is the thing that's actually holding up the legislation. I've also heard money, that it's too expensive. Those are the two things that I've sort of heard in the rumor mill around Ottawa. So we'll see how that plays out. But it could put her in a very awkward position again if she's removing rights out of legislation that the Trudeau government had in the legislation that First Nations very much want. So, or if the bill becomes, like a cheaper version of itself, where it's not giving the financial support to clean water. Because it's not like, like chiefs don't want clean water on the reserve, so they're just not doing it. They have the jurisdiction for clean water over the reserves. They don't have the money, they don't have the capacity, and they don't have the control over the environment that they need. So those are the problems that the bill is trying to solve. So any one of those things coming out is going to reflect poorly on her. So I think, I think there's a lot of respect being shown her. I think behind the scenes, she seems to spend a lot of her time talking to First Nations leaders. But those two things are really showing that, as she said herself at the Assembly of First Nation, her path is different from First Nations leaders who are representing their communities.
Yeah, and somebody smarter than me who's more in tune with what's going on in Ottawa told me that they'd heard she'd been told to consult on S2 until the thing dies. Make sure it never passes. And I really look forward to the book that I hope she eventually writes one day when she's not in government anymore, because there's a lot of things behind the scenes that we never hear about until they leave and write a book. And yeah, so I would.
You think she's gonna go Jody? You think she's gonna go Jody?
I think that's the only way. Yeah.
I guess on a similar vein, with the S2 issue, as you've mentioned before, we also saw that this push for consultation, was really prevalent. But on the flip side, we saw major natural resource projects getting passed with little to no consultation at all. I'm wondering, what do you think is behind this disparity?
Right, like that's kind of the thing. If why are you consulting on this thing if you want it passed and it's an easy win on the S2, but you're being told consult, consult, consult. But on things that they really want to get through, we'll host a meeting with 600 of you in a room, hopefully, and we'll count that as consultation number one. And we'll put a couple of you on a panel, which the
Zoom.
Yeah, which the
It's called Zoom.
Yes, exactly right. The minister. And like even the panel, like I think any of us could have picked out those Indigenous members of that panel. Like these are all people who for decades have been pro economic development, and I think they probably back some of these projects and would like to see some of these projects move ahead themselves.
Yeah, I think the consultation here and the consultation not there, like, I mean, this is just, it's the weaponizing of reconciliation, really. You don't realize how much Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was pushing reconciliation until he's gone. And while he was imperfect and sometimes arrogant and did strange things, he was very schizophrenic government because on one hand, he was all about reconciliation. On the other hand, he was just as guilty as fighting some of the child welfare cases, the ongoing child welfare cases in court, as any of his predecessors. So it was like a weird kind of schizophrenic government that he had. But it would be very hard to see. I don't think Trudeau could have come up with a bill like C5. I don't think he as a prime minister would have taken that approach to climate or that approach to First Nations and consultation. I don't think he could have figured out how to get it done and also uphold the values that he had. Carney's coming in with different values. He definitely wants to get this done. And when he says One Canadian Economy Act, I'm pretty convinced, like, when somebody tells you who they are, believe them. He wants one Canadian economy. And so it's more like First Nations and everybody coming into his vision for the unfolding of Canada, rather than perhaps creating their own vision of development and having Canada meet them halfway. So I think that's why the consultation when you have to, but only as much as you need to. And maybe no consultation somewhere else, and then sometimes consultation being weaponized as a way to stall things. I think that's what we're seeing. Yeah,
we just had Mohawk historian and Indigenous studies professor Cody Grote on face to face this week, and he was talking about Trudeau embraced the rhetoric of reconciliation, even if he didn't necessarily live up to that rhetoric, whereas Carney's not even embracing the rhetoric. We're beyond that now. It's been 10 years. We're moving on.
Yeah. And, it's funny that you say that the rhetoric, you just bring back that memory of when Trudeau was first elected and all his ministers suddenly were going around talking nation to nation and, fair, prior, informed consent and just speaking language as if they were at a Chiefs meeting, or something. Like, I was just like, wait a second, is this the government of Canada or is this like the national chief? I'm not sure. Like, they really took that language in. And you don't hear that anymore.
Karyn, something I remember you saying, I can't remember what, it might have been at kind of around election time, this idea of being in a post-reconciliation era. I'm wondering if we could maybe speak to that a bit, because I know we haven't talked about that in a while, and I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on this?
It feels like it's a post-reconciliation era. I mean, where I'm seeing it stick, actually, is with the courts. And the court decisions are coming out very much looking at the lens of all that has been learned, like from 2015 and the time of the TRC, right? So when we're looking at Jordan's principal cases, the courts are saying, well, equality is not equity. You cannot treat a First Nations child on a reserve with a historic intergenerational trauma and poverty the same way that you treat, like a privileged white middle-class kid in Toronto, that you really, in order to make things equitable, you can't treat them equally. And so we're seeing those kind of decisions come through the court. So it's kind of stuck there. I think, the universities, which tend to be, left-leaning kind of spaces these days, they aren't always, but these days they seem to be like kind of in the last throes of wokeness. I think that they still are exploring reconciliation, but in terms of like the federal government and in terms of the other governments, the provincial governments that have gotten elected, a lot of them are passing laws that undo First Nations rights or undo, services or laws that First Nations were in favor of. Nova Scotia is trying to undo a fracking ban. Ontario is pushing forward Bill 5, which speeds up mining, essentially, or approvals for mining. Quebec tried to do the same with forestry, where they created zones where, certain approvals didn't have to apply. And they ended up having to, that one didn't pass. There was a coordinated effort to stop it, and it did stop. But we are seeing all this kind of backtracking of progress that was made. But what I will say is I was surprised that progress was ever made in the first place. I mean, I thought in 2015 that report was going to get shelved like the 1996 Royal Commission, and that there would be a big report that would come out. Everybody would say, wow, we really learned a lot. And then the report would be the thing, right? And everybody would walk away. I wasn't expecting continuity out of that, or, almost 10 years of sustained forward growth out of it. So it's going to be, it wasn't just a year or two of reconciliation where everything goes back. There's some substance and some force behind reconciliation, I think, in some institutions, even if it's out of government at the moment, that's going to hold government in check. So it's not going to backslide easily or quickly, but it can backslide.
We also saw many political developments within the AFN, and I'm wondering, which do you both think are maybe some of the most notable?
Well, I could go, I guess, again, to reference a recent panel, Negon Sinclair, one of our panelists, mentioning that this is the most liberal-friendly AFN that there's probably ever been, in terms of the national chief being a former member, a young liberal, and connected with the Liberal Party, and many people there involved with it. And if they can't get this Liberal government to consult on major projects, to do some of these things that they're asking, S2, water, child welfare, then who can, I guess. So I think child welfare is going to, and Jordan's Principle are going to be a really big one coming forward, just because of that decision that's coming soon. But when it comes to major projects, they were passing the resolution on major projects and wanting the AFN to pass these resolutions, but then they all often say that the AFN rightfully isn't a rights holder and shouldn't be the one doing the consultation. So yeah, it's still kind of dicey on what they can accomplish, I guess.
Yeah, I'll pick up right where you left off. I've been thinking about this a lot. I did work at the AFN. I was on the other side. You can argue about who's on the dark side. The used to see media was on the dark side. And when we're in media, we say the AFN is the dark side. But I was there for 6 years, I think. I was there for the end of Phil Fontaine's service as national chief, and for the first couple of years of Sean Atleos. And I learned quite a bit from being on the inside, but I think my observations would be true whether I'd worked there or not. I just like to give a disclaimer before I speak about the AFN, because just so people know, just for transparency's sake. When you had chiefs like Phil Fontaine, they went in with a mandate, and they kind of ran and said, I'm going to be the national chief that gets these 3 things accomplished. And then once they were elected, they acted very much the way a prime minister or any non-native government acts. And they would say, well, you elected me on this mandate, so this is what I'm doing. And so for Phil Fontaine, it was residential schools. He came back and said, give me one more mandate. Let me get this to bed. I want to get compensation for survivors, and I want to get a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in place. And he got elected, and that's what he focused on. And he didn't go running back to chiefs. I mean, people complained, right? Like, there were survivors that didn't like the compensation package that he negotiated. There were people who didn't think a TRC was the right way to go. But he walked in with a vision, and I think Sean Atleo did the same. So Sean Atleo said, I'm going to be the education. I'm going to be the guy who fixes education. And in the end, the plan he came up with was not accepted by chiefs. It was soundly rejected. They felt that it was negotiated too tightly with the Stephen Harper government at the time and wasn't representative. And that blew up, and he ended up resigning as national chief. But they did go in with these mandates. And it's interesting. I'm not sure that Perry Bellegarde had a mandate. And I felt like he was kind of one of the quieter national chiefs that we'd seen in a while. And then you've got Roseanne Archibald, who was elected and removed, and that lawsuit is still going on. So we arrive, by the time this national chief gets there, in a real state of flux. And one of the things, as Dennis pointed out, that happens is chiefs are saying, we're the rights holders, you're not. And so that really clips a national chief's wings on what they can talk about. And then, you know, there's always disagreement amongst the chiefs about, you know, like things like how much development, how much consultation. And those are things that like really have to be on a nation to nation basis. A national chief cannot negotiate those things for 633. I mean, it would be a nightmare. I don't want that job either. Like, you can't do it. So what is the AFN? We're kind of back at that question again. It was decided it was in the government. It's supposed to be a lobby group. But what does it actually have permission to lobby on? And the national chief, this one, Cindy Woodhouse-Neepanak, I think chose infrastructure and was really trying to push that as the thing that she can talk about, which I think is fairly non-controversial. No chief is going to say, I want less housing. I want less water. You know, I want less buildings. Nobody's going to say that. So, but she hasn't really been able to get that mandate on the table, because the other thing that Dennis pointed out was that it's a very liberal funding AFN. And because of that, she's had the great success of getting so many ministers in at this SCA on panels to talk, to take questions from chiefs. But then at the end of the day, whose agenda are you following? And so now she's found a space where she's the mediator and bringing in the government to talk to the chiefs, which seems like a good idea. But the AFN is not setting its own direction. There wasn't a lot about infrastructure or the types of things that the national chief had said she was going to build her mandate on. So it's a remaking of the AFN. I think she's navigating this. Like, her first thing is to keep the chiefs from getting really angry at her. And she seems to be navigating that pretty well. But finding the new space that the AFN is going to operate on and what it's supposed to morph into as a non-rights holding body that represents chief, but we're not sure what its real mandate is because it doesn't operate as it used to. I think it'll be interesting to see how it rebuilds relevance or how it rebuilds its role in the political system.
And often many rocks are thrown at the AFN, but I think many of these political organizations right now are in interesting times. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Métis National Council has like 2 members left, and one of them is the MNO, which has its own things going on. The Métis Nation British Columbia turfed their president. The FSIN in Saskatchewan has like the audit and all its issues going on there with some of the infighting. Like, many of these political organizations, or those that are even actual like Métis governments or say that they are in turmoil.
Yeah, the women's organizations too, Pok Tutit and the Native Women's Association of Canada.
Right.
And then there is the Métis Women's Organization. But, I was just talking to the MMF, and they're very clear with me that they don't recognize that association as representative. So, I mean, it used to be, there was a time in Ottawa where you could run to any one of these political organizations and, made your job easy because you could get feedback. But they all seem to be in different stages of falling apart and going through a really weak moment.
And when you ask people about that, commentators about it, most of them will all point to the massive amounts of funding that went into these organizations during the Trudeau years. Like even the MMF went from like a budget of like $5 million a year to now like $400 million. They own half of downtown Winnipeg. Like a lot of money went into these organizations, and it might not have been beneficial. It's led to some infighting.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I'm also wondering, I've heard things coming out of the AFN, and I'm waiting to see, I need to take a look at their books and see how much money they're getting, because they've got a nice office here and everything. But I keep hearing things like there's been a restriction on hiring and restriction on staff. And I don't know if that means that they're just at the edges of their budget, or if they've had any cutbacks to their budget. That would be another thing to watch for in the new year.
Yeah, and I guess, relatedly, that takes me to this last question. So now that we've looked back at some of the key issues that unfolded in 2025, let's look ahead. What do you think will be the top issues to look out for in 2026?
The very first project that gets approved under the Major Projects Office, because the ones that have been approved so far, as was pointed out by opposition leader Pierre Poilievre, were all things that were already in the making and already things that were very close to approval. So it was kind of like announcing things that are like 3/4 done anyway. The first thing that goes from scratch is going to be interesting. Also, one of the things I was just talking about today was, which I haven't been following as close as I should have, is the Ring of Fire. It's just kind of sat there with the same political arguments around it for, a decade now. But there's a real move by the Ford government to get it going. And Doug Ford just signed with Mark Carney, according to the Canadian press reporting today, I guess an agreement that of what they were talking about along, that there's going to be one window for environmental approvals. And Mark Carney at the Special Chiefs Assembly was very clear that the speeding up that he wants to do is not at the expense of consultations. Now, chiefs don't always believe that, but that's what he's been saying. But where he is going to speed things up is in these environmental reviews, because they happen separately, one after the other, but often contain the same things. So that it's duplication for no reason, and they're just getting rid of the duplication. And I was thinking, this is where you're really trusting people to be honest Johnnies. Do you trust, if the federal government says we no longer need to look at, whether or not companies are ticking these boxes, because Ontario is looking at that, or, Saskatchewan is looking at that. And then Ontario, are they really going to do it? They don't have the same fiduciary responsibilities to First Nations that the federal government does. I think that there's some question there. There's some eye that needs to be on exactly when they're removing the duplication, what it is that they're taking out, and to be making sure that it's still happening to the same standards and levels. That all gets very nerdy, and it's a lot of work, but I'm definitely going to be doing that. I guarantee it will be days of work that ends up in a very short, 3-paragraph article, but it will be worth it.
Major projects for sure, child welfare for sure. We kind of focused a lot on politics here, which I like to talk about. But I think one thing that we didn't cover that I'll be watching for is this ongoing drugs and violence issue. There were multiple mass casualty events on First Nations in the past year. 49 First Nations in Northern Ontario, where the Ring of Fire is supposed to happen, are under a state of emergency over violence and drugs, saying that they're at the point where they're unable to govern their own nations because of drug dealers coming in. It's a big deal, and everybody keeps calling these states of emergencies, and nothing ever gets done. It just keeps on going.
That's a really good point. My community, Pikwakanagan, is under a state of emergency as well due to opioid addiction. So, I mean, I've talked several times to Jeff Copen, as he's one of the chiefs who tends to be like, just put his heart in his sleeve and return phone calls whenever you need a chief to return phone calls. And he's repeatedly said that with the mental health crisis in his community and the addiction crisis in his community, they're in no position to, be signing deals on development, because I think we know that history tells us that development doesn't make addiction problems go away. It actually makes them worse. So those two things, are we should talk about them, not so siloed maybe next year, Dennis, but talk about them more hand in hand and how they go together.
Indeed.
Thank you both so much for joining us to do a look back and also a look ahead. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Cierra.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Fun to be on a show with Dennis.
That's all for this episode, and that's all for this year. Thanks for joining us each week. And if you're enjoying the show, please leave us a rating and review on your player of choice or email suggestions to infocus@aptn.ca. Also, give us a follow. It helps other people find the show. This episode was produced by Mark Blackburn and edited by Jesse Andrushko. Charmaine Straker is the executive producer of APTN News InFocus. I'm Cierra Bettens. Thanks for listening. Talk to you in the new year.
Homeless people aren't hard to find in Winnipeg. They're on the sidewalks, in bus shelters, and down alleyways. They're living in tents and squatting in empty buildings. They're even sleeping in abandoned cars. But who are they? And why are they here? Find out in Our Relatives, Life on the Streets, hosted by me, Kathleen Martins. Listen on your favorite podcast player.